Welcome, everybody. My name's Steve Ostrander. I'm the local rep for Tamron. We want to thank the camera company for hosting this event. We've had some very successful ones over the last month, and we've got 3 more coming up this month, this one and 2 additional ones. So we're doing them the next couple of Thursdays also at 3:30. So check that out if you want to join in. I know we have some return viewers, so we appreciate you coming back, and it's always something new to learn. And as we normally do with this, we'll keep everybody muted, but there is the chat section. If you do have questions as we go along, put those questions in the chat section, and we'll try to answer them as we go along. If we don't get to them during the presentation, Jeff or I will answer them at the end. I just want to remind everybody that here we're coming up on the Father's Day promotional period. So we do have some instant savings going on a lot of our lenses right now, if something is of interest. And we will have, you'll see an announcement tomorrow about some Father's Day savings that start tomorrow. So since we're late in the day, I can't tell you exactly what they are, but it is something that you'll want to check out. The camera company will have all the details on that. You may see an email from them about that tomorrow morning. So we do have also some additional savings for the people that are going to join in on we have a virtual event with the camera company coming up tomorrow. And I'll be answering questions, and it'll just be me and you guys. I'll be answering questions from 1 to 3 tomorrow. So again, the camera company's website will have all that information. You may have already received that information. So we do have some deals for the participants in that too. We do have a new lens that was introduced today. And for you Sony shooters, your Sony E-mount shooters, Jeff has it on his camera. I just got my sample also. This is a 28-200 Sony full frame E-mount. It's the first 28-200, the first all-in-one lens that starts at 2.8. Most of them are usually slower than that. It's a 2.8 to 5.6. You can see it's small and lightweight, and in the tradition of the other E-mount lenses, it's 67mm filter size again. Everything we've made in full frame E-mount is all 67mm. And it's fluorine coated. It's got all the same bells and whistles as the other ones. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail on that, but that was introduced today, and all the details are on our site. The camera company has all the information, and if you're interested in that lens, they can take orders on it now. It will start delivering on June 25th. And that's about all that I have for right now. Again, if you have any questions as we go along, let us know, and I'm going to turn it over to Jeff.
Okay. Also, if Ed's still there, if you want to start recording the event, or if you're
It's
recording. Okay. I didn't see that on my end. Oh, now I do.
See it here.
I see it. Yeah. Wasn't looking at the right corner. Well, thanks, Steve. And again, this I've had this lens in my hands since day before yesterday. So no, yesterday actually. I think I got it. At any rate, no, day before yesterday. But I've had almost no time to put light through it. But what I've seen, if you're a Sony shooter and you're looking for something that's compact and you can take it anywhere and it's going to give you great results in the wide angle, telephoto, and close-up modes, it's a superb performer. If you followed Tamron for any length of time, you know that our engineers don't release something until it's ready for prime time and it's best in class. So it's something that I think I've had a lot of questions from from Sony users about when Tamron was going to do that. And, you know, basically my answer is, well, when they think they have the right formula. And so it's here, and I think it'll be, you know, priced very right, especially compared to anything else that's out there. And it'll be shipping to stores. Basically, you'll start to see them before the end of June. So within the next couple of weeks, you'll see that happening.
Yeah, the price point is $729.
Yeah, amazing.
So very, very good price point for
Yeah,
all-in-one,
absolutely.
especially something that starts at 2.8.
Yeah, nothing else like it on the market today. So that'll be fun, and we'll stop the ad because I know you'd like to probably learn more about some birding photography, and so I will make this happen here. Where's my play button? I had to switch from Keynote, which I normally use, because I've been having some technical difficulties with it since the last. Uh, I'm a Mac guy, and Mac did an update, and Zoom did an update, and suddenly Keynote and Zoom don't like to play as well as they were the last few weeks. There we go. Now I think we have it. Yeah, I'm looking at my monitor and I see that too. So with that, we shall get going here. Again, welcome. I'm Tamron Tech Jeff Allen. And I got to see if I can kill my audio over here. I can hear myself talking in the background too. At any rate, thanks to the folks at Camera Company for inviting us back for another event. We've had some pretty amazing turnouts and webinars here. Steve, can you verify that my slide is in the middle of the screen, or is it?
Yes, it is.
Okay, yeah, I think it's just my machine being goofy. There it is. All right, wanted to make sure I was seeing everything right on the monitor. So without further ado, I really will get started. Thanks once again to Camera Company, and we're continuing to do these webinars with them, and thanks to your support, they've been very well accepted. So I'm Tamron Tech Jeff. We will have a question and answer period at the end of the webinar, but in case you come up with a question after we've closed up or anything, you can contact me on all the social media as Tamron Tech Jeff. So I'm happy to join you there and answer any questions. I find that I get my questions posted to me fastest on Facebook or on Instagram. The Twitter questions seem to randomly show up maybe days later. So if you're looking for a quick response, check in with me on Facebook or Instagram, and I usually see those right away and respond right away. So before we get started with the pictures of the birds and the how-tos there, I want to establish some basics of your camera operation. And I do this with pretty much every seminar because we never know whether we have the seasoned veterans or whether we have people who are new to adjustable camera photography. So for the veterans, this may be a little bit of a review for you. And for you who are new to photography, I hope this helps you get accelerated onto the right path to get going and be more successful with your camera. So most modern cameras are going to have that green auto position where the camera does virtually everything. And that can be your best friend. You just don't want it to be your best friend forever, because what can happen is you end up with perfectly exposed blurs sometimes, and that's probably not what you were envisioning. So if you move even to the program mode, it gives you a little control. You can probably control ISO, and maybe even with the control wheel, control shutter speed or aperture up or down. But again, pretty limited as to what you can do with the camera. So I think the meat and potatoes of most creative photography lies within the aperture priority and the shutter priority areas. But also when you're getting started, don't be afraid to use those scene modes. Your camera on with an analog dial or an LCD on the top or the back may allow you to go into different scenes, and you'll have like a head and shoulders for portraits, and you'll have a mountain icon for scenery, and generally like a running man or something like that for action and sports and wildlife. And again, for bird photography, that would be a good one to get started with. And the neat thing about that is I go back in photography far enough to have shot. My first camera was a film camera, of course, mechanical manual exposure. I had to choose shutter speed and aperture for every shot. I had to, line up a meter needle in the viewfinder. And the cameras, of course, today are a lot easier to do that with. But I find most of my shooting in aperture and shutter priority gets me what I need in terms of getting what I'm envisioning in a shot. I do occasionally use manual, and for instance, on this next photograph, um, this was a manual exposure shot, and it was done for several reasons. First of all, this is kind of a unique bird in flight. That's actually a snowboarder, of course, and we were shooting some videos and stills for some Tamron tutorials and videos at Tahoe, and so we're on the side of the mountain. We had a number of snowboarders coming off the jump for us, and one of our tech team members used to work at Tahoe, so he knew a number of people out there that were able to spend some time doing tricks off the jump for us. But at any rate, we got there late morning. We're going to be shooting in the same location for several hours. As you can see, bright, clear, sunny day. The sun's in the photo, so that has to be compensated for. And obviously, because the subjects, the snowboarders, were backlit, we had to compensate for that. So in manual exposure, we after some test shots, we knew that we were going to need 1,000th of a second shutter speed, 1/1000th, and that allowed the snowboarder to be frozen in flight. And we knew we were going to need a lot of depth of field. We were shooting with a full frame lens, 24-70 wide angle at 24 millimeters. And we ended up shooting at f/16, and that gave us enough depth of field to carry from the foreground all the way through to those clouds in the sky a sharp image. So that was important. And then to get all of that and get the snowboarders and the trees in the foreground there properly exposed so that they weren't silhouetted by the sun behind them, we ended up with an ISO of 800. Now, we could also have shot in shutter or aperture priority and gotten that, but we would have needed probably to have gone to exposure compensation, which I'll talk about later in the presentation. And because the light value was going to be the same pretty much all day, we didn't need to use auto ISO, which I'll talk a little bit more about also in the presentation.
Hey, Jeff, I just want to interrupt just for a second.
Yes.
I want to ask Ed, I noticed that the chat is disabled. Could you or he turn on the chat, please?
Yeah, Ed will have to do that because I don't see it on my screen currently with the presentation. So maybe Ed can enable the chat. And I've heard the doorbell. We might have had a couple of other latecomers show up that may need to be admitted to the presentation also.
Yeah, there has been some others come in. Go ahead.
Okay, good deal. So moving along, I'm going to talk next about understanding aperture and depth of field. And again, for those of you new to photography, it can sometimes be one of those concepts that's a little hard to wrap your head around. And what you'll see is that the small numbers like 2 and 1.4 and 2.8 are actually the large apertures. They allow the larger volume of light through. So that can be kind of counterintuitive. But then as what we call it stop down by going to those smaller apertures, the larger numbers like f11 and 16 and 22, those allow a smaller volume of light, but the depth of field, the area of sharp focus begins to increase. Now the trade-off is, of course, less light through the lens means lower shutter speed in order to get a good exposure or a higher ISO. And we'll kind of get those things dovetailed here so they all make sense, I hope. At any rate, here's kind of a great picture example of what happens when changing aperture and depth of field. This beautiful blue flower looks great at 2.8. You can see a little bit of a shimmer kind of in the background, but nothing that's going to take the viewer's eye away from the intended subject in the frame. But as we begin to stop down, the point of focus doesn't change any. The flower is still still where the lens was focused, but you'll notice that at f11 and then certainly by f22, and even to a certain extent at 5.6, that piece of lawn furniture in the background, which is bright colored, tends to start to show up more distinctly, and more importantly, it's bright, so it takes the viewer's eye away from the intended subject. And that's one of those things when you're looking at foreground-background relationships. A bright, even out of focus subject will tend to draw the viewer's eye away, and if it's a bright in focus subject, it will really draw the viewer's eye away. So that's why it's important to review in the field with your digital camera. Look at that view screen and make sure that those foreground-background relationships are just the way you want them to be. Otherwise, you may not be able to present that image the way you were envisioning. Now, the next thing in the exposure triangle, as we call it, and you can actually go to the Tamron website, and we have short tutorials about the exposure triangle in the Tamron videos section. I believe they're up in the Tamron YouTube page as well. But at any rate, I've been saying that a lot. Shutter speed is that fraction of a second that the shutter opens and closes. So here the high numbers they make sense. It's a fraction of a second, 1/250th, 1/1000th of a second. Those are tiny fractions of a second, and they're able to stop things in motion. And then as we go to the lower and slower shutter speeds, longer exposure times, then moving subjects can tend to blur. So again, you have to find that balance to get the correct shutter speed. And next, if your computer has a screen grab feature, you might want to do a screen grab of this, or even just simply pick the camera, your cell phone up and take a quick screenshot of that right away. I'll leave it up for a few moments. A slow moving or motionless subject up to 125th of a second is probably going to be fine. Now it is somewhat focal length dependent, and longer focal length lenses induce more shake. So if your lens is all the way zoomed out, you're going to magnify not only the subject, but magnify any camera shake or movement that you might have. So it's important to keep that in mind too. Even with a motionless subject, you may need a higher shutter speed. So again, review in the field and go out and practice. With a slowly moving subject, maybe a walking bird or a human or something, up to a 250th of a second may be enough. A soaring bird in flight where they're not flapping their wings too much, up to a 500th of a second, and you may even be able to freeze wing movement at a 500th. But as you can see by this the example shot here, at 1,000th of a second, this hawk, who was an injured animal and was flying. It's an animal ambassador at a raptor rehabilitation group now. It can't be released back into the wild, but it can fly short distances between two handlers, and it was flapping its wings. But those tiny feathers, those small feathers, even at the wingtips, are soft or sharp. They're frozen in motion, and that's what 1,000th of a second will do. Now in this next shot, I was out photographing a bald eagle one morning, dull gray, cloudy, overcast, trying to snow that day. But the eagle had just launched from its perch on a tree, and it was taking off to go, maybe it spotted something to go hunt for brunch. And it was really flapping those wings hard. And at just that little smidgen of a difference in shutter speed from 1,000th of a second to 1/500th of a second, then you can see that motion blur in the wingtips. Now, sometimes I like to show that motion blur where I can pan with the subject. I can follow the subject and keep the subject centered in the viewfinder. So the torso and everything, and the beak and the face, the eyes are nice and sharp, but the wings have that little bit of motion blur. So that may be one thing you want to encounter and adjust and play with. Try some shots at really high shutter speeds, so you know you're going to freeze that wing flapping motion, and then maybe drop to see what looks good or what looks interesting. Adds a little interest, as I think it does with the eagle here, to the frame. And then Tamron and I am fortunate enough to be part of our tech team that goes out and teaches and works at events and birding festivals. And we routinely go every year to uh, the Bosque del Apache Wild Bird Festival in Socorro, New Mexico. That's about 2.5 hours south of Albuquerque, at the Bosque del Apache National Wildlife Reserve. And it's a week-long event during the fall migration, as sandhill cranes and snow geese are headed south for the winter. And this is one of their big stopping points, because it's a very inviting, large wetland area that they can feel relatively safe in as they're making their trip south. But after several days of shooting the birds, you've gotten, dozens, hundreds, maybe thousands of good images of sharp, frozen, beautiful, you know, beautiful detail in the feathers and everything, shots of the birds. And as a photographer, by that point, I'm going, yeah, I've got a lot of sharp bird pictures. Maybe I want to stretch my creative legs a little bit. So here on a tripod, started again playing with the shutter speeds as the birds take off, and they do this instinctually every morning. These sand hills, as you can see at the bottom of the frame, haven't taken off yet. They're still kind of foraging in the wetland, but it's like somebody fires a starter pistol with the sun just before sunrise gets to the sky gets to a certain brightness, and the snow geese just take off, thousands at a time, in just a few moments. And what we went for here is that slow shutter speed to completely blur them out and create that motion blur and a nice, beautiful abstract, but we still have that the bottom of the frame holding everything together with the sandhill cranes that hadn't launched yet. So that's something you may also want to experiment with. It's not going to be something you'll shoot a lot of, but again, play with those longer shutter speeds where you can lock down on a monopod, or even easier on a tripod, and and experiment with something like that. Pardon me, a little seasonal allergy thing. I'll probably have to stop during the presentation a couple of times for sips of water, and maybe also another throat lozenge to keep everything dry, or to keep everything from getting dry. Now, here's another thought with shooting birds. It doesn't always have to be long telephoto lenses where you have that nice close-up detail. In this situation, I actually shot with the 28 to 75 millimeter on a full-frame Sony camera, and at 28 millimeters, again, a fairly wide angle. What I got here was, again, just before sunrise. I got there was a storm moving in, so the birds were on the move to get out of the path of the storm. But we had a fantastic sunrise, so I was more there thinking about, well, I need to get these some great sunrise images. Always handy to have in your portfolio anyway. And so again, set the camera on the tripod and started firing as birds were flying through the scene with that wide angle. And there I was able to get at ISO 100, and I was using auto ISO here because the white values were changing so much. I wanted to shoot at f2.8 wide open because it was still pretty dark. And as you can see, a 1/160th of a second. And the camera chose for me at this particular situation a 100 ISO. Now, as I mentioned, I started photography with film. So I had, one choice of film sensitivity, and you shot 36 exposures before you could change to a different film speed. With digital, of course, you can either automatically with auto ISO or manually adjust that sensitivity on your sensor up or down, so that you can get the exposure but maintain a specific shutter speed aperture combination. So That's I think, a real benefit to the newest cameras that have that auto ISO mode. And some of these functions, if again you're not familiar with them in your camera, you can go to your owner's manual, or you can always go to your camera body maker's website or to their YouTube pages, and they'll usually have tutorials on all of the specific features and functions of your camera on their websites or on their social media pages. And it's a great way to learn about some of these things that you may not know about, or you may not know how to use them or set them on the camera. So that's a fantastic resource that you can fall back on too. So understanding ISO. Now, as I've spoken for the last few moments, the ISO is the relative sensitivity to light that your camera sensor has. Now, most modern cameras have a fairly low what we call native ISO, and this is the sensitivity that the engineers have calibrated the sensor for, so that it's going to give its maximum performance. And most newer cameras are a native sensitivity of around 100, 200. 100 to 200, in that range. And there are some specialty cameras, like Sony has one camera model series, their S series, that has actually an incredibly high native ISO of 51,200. And so for people who are doing all low light shooting, or a lot of low light shooting, and they need that specific tool, that's been designed by the manufacturers as well. But generally, the secret to getting the best shot is to use the lowest ISO you can for the scene. Um, so in a perfect world, again, ISO 100, 200 are going to give you the best results. I will often shoot when I am out in the field. I'll go with a moving subject. I'm not afraid at all with my current cameras to go to ISO of 400 or even 800 sometimes, as light levels diminish, or if it's a cloudy day, because I need to know that I can get a high shutter speed and maybe a large aperture as well, so that I can isolate my subject, and I need that high ISO in order to get that. And then for something like this night sky scene, in order to get a good exposure there, you simply have to go to a higher ISO, and in this case, ISO 3200. Now, off topic a little bit, if you want to do night sky photography, of course, tripod, you'll need a remote release of some sort for your camera. The folks at Camera Company can advise you on that as to what's going to work with your camera. And then, you know, a good starting point for this is 16 to 3200 ISO, and you'll want to shoot with a very fast lens. I shot this particular lens with the 15 to 30 f2.8 lens, but I actually was set at f4 just to allow me a little smidgen of focus error coverage. And here, the formula for getting a good exposure of pinpoints of light, the stars pinpointed without having any star trails because of Earth's movement, is a shutter, or an ISO, I'm sorry, a shutter speed that you take your focal length and divide into 500. So with a 15 millimeter lens, that math comes out to 30.333 seconds. So I can shoot a 30-second exposure and get those nice pinpoints of light. If I was shooting a 50 millimeter lens, to get those pinpoints of light before, again, the star trails started to happen, I could only shoot for 10 seconds. So a wide angle lens definitely lends itself to night sky photography. Again, a topic for another time, and I think Camera Company may have actually hosted a webinar or two on night sky photography. You can check their website for more details on that. Now, also, stability is going to be a very important factor. Most Tamron lenses have built-in image stabilization, what Tamron calls vibration compensation. And again, it helps you shoot at longer shutter speeds without having any motion-induced blur, just from simply, you know, bumping around with the camera, or not being able to steadily hold it. And as I mentioned also, as you zoom out, increasing telephoto magnification does tend to increase everything, including any camera shake. So a tripod, and I recommend, if you're doing bird photography and you have long lenses, Also talking to the pros at camera company about looking at a gimbal head for your tripod. This allows very smooth movement. The camera rides in it, so your tilting up and down becomes very smooth, and your panning left to right becomes very smooth also. So it's a very, very handy tool with long lenses, and especially with birds in flight. If you go out to wetland areas that attract bird photographers, you'll probably see a good number of them shooting with a gimbal head. Now, for quicker action or when you're on the go, a monopod can be a very useful tool. And I'll even sometimes slap my gimbal head on my monopod, although usually there, again, because I want to travel light, I'll just let the monopod support the camera, and I'll pan and tilt as needed. The advantage of supporting your camera on a tripod or a monopod is more stability, first of all. And the other thing is, as opposed to wearing the camera around your neck all day and just keeping yourself like this with your elbows tucked in and your arms crooked all day, you start to get muscle pain in your neck and your shoulders and your back. And again, take that stress off of yourself and support the camera on some sort of steady platform like this. And you'll just have a more pleasant experience. And after several hours out in the field, you're not going to be walking back to your car all hunched over thinking you need to find a different hobby because you're just in pain from being crunched up so much. So again, a good monopod or tripod, maybe augmented with a gimbal head. The camera company folks will be able to explain what's going to work best for your lens and camera combination, and of course for your budget too. They have things that'll fit a lot of different budgets too. Now, I talked very quickly at the beginning about exposure compensation when you saw that first image of the snowboarder. And the reason exposure compensation is important, if you're shooting in one of the automatic modes, aperture or shutter priority, or if you're using auto ISO, the camera sees this scene, and it's a photographer's worst nightmare. It's a camera's worst nightmare because light meters are calibrated to bring back a medium gray exposure as being correct. And in a lot of scenes, you don't have to compensate for that. But with a relatively darkly clothed person on this vast expanse of snow and ice, what's going to happen is the meter sees all of that vast white area, and it thinks, oh, really bright, got to go to a high shutter speed, smaller aperture, and what you end up with then as a result is a silhouette, and that's probably not what you're after. Now, the same thing happens with birds in the sky and birds around the water. You're going to get that high reflective value or just the brightness from the sky, and you get a silhouette if you don't compensate for that. So again, this may be here's one of your assignments. Learn how to use the exposure compensation on your camera. It may be an analog dial like you see in the center of the frame. It might be a button that you press for plus and minus that you rotate another dial. It may be like what you see there with the LCD that might be on the top screen. Or it might be on the back screen of your camera. Again, this is where your owner's manual or your camera body maker's video tutorials can come in very handy. And they'll have explanations of how to find this, how to control it, how to switch it on and off so that you get the correct exposure. And it's really important. As you can see by these shots, same scene, nothing changed except we adjusted the exposure compensation to -1 and -2 stops. This is equivalent to one shutter speed or one click stop on your aperture, and then overexposing by 1 and 2 stops. So if your subject is in fact backlit, or like you see with the scene on the right-hand side of the frame, those two where we went to +1 and +2, birds in the sky, birds around water where there's a lot of reflection, you'll want to experiment with your camera and just go out in the backyard or to the neighborhood park or pond or something and play with these settings to see what's going to work best for you. And then when you get out and you're really shooting seriously, you'll have these kinds of things dialed in, and you'll know that you can that you can compensate for them. Now the other two, the -1, -2 settings, if you have a very brightly colored bird, but maybe it's against a dark background, like sunlit, but there's dark trees in the background, then you may need to go to a -1 or maybe even -2 to actually cut down the exposure, because again, the light meter sees that vast darker area, and it wants to tell the camera to underexpose. So getting to know that exposure compensation is very important in being more successful. Then when we get out in the field, you want to zoom your lens if you have a zoom lens. Move your feet left, right, move maybe physically closer or further away. Um, Change your point of view a little bit. I carry with me routinely in the back seat of or the trunk of the car some like a gardener's knee pad or some construction knee pads and even a tarp. So if I want to get down very low to the ground, I can spread out. I don't get dirty. It's easier to kneel. It's also easier to stand back up when you're using those knee pads. I'll even sometimes carry a little step ladder in the car so that I can get up a couple of steps higher. Or if I'm if I'm driving the pickup, I can actually stand up in the back of the truck, provided that my subject is within a shooting range of where I parked, and I'm able to just change my perspective a little bit. And you'll want to. I used to shoot very tight, and really zoom in tight on my subject so that the composition I saw in my viewfinder was what I was going to intend for the computer screen. And generally speaking, the aspect ratio of your camera sensor is similar to the aspect ratio, the height and width of your computer screen. But when you get into making prints, and please make prints of your best photos. They don't have an off switch. They make great gifts. Prints also have much greater longevity. But the aspect ratios of prints don't match up to the height and width of your camera sensor. They're going to be slightly different. So I shoot a little bit loose now so that I can crop in post and make sure that I include and exclude what I want to have in my scene that way. And also play with your depth of field to emphasize the subject by itself or the subject when it's in its environment. And those can be different ways of again, showing off the look that you're trying to achieve. A little bit about composition too. Composition. The rule of thirds is important to know, and we used to call it the rule of thirds. I think a lot of myself and a lot of other photo instructors are now calling it kind of the suggestions of composition rather than the rules, because nothing has to be hard and fast, and you're not going to nail that subject exactly 1/3 of the way in from the edge of the frame and 1/3 of the way from the top or the bottom. But getting subjects in that general vicinity, 1/3 of the way in from the side and 1/3 of the way in from the top or bottom, tends to make for a stronger composition that, again, the viewer's eye tends to linger longer looking at those. Also look for groups. Our brain likes to see odd numbers, groups of 3 especially. Use leading lines, something that leads the viewer to your subject. That can be the edge of a wing. It can be a walking path. It can be maybe a fence line, anything out in the field, a tree branch even. So think of things like that to help strengthen your compositions. They don't always work, but there's something to keep at the back of your mind. And when you get out in the field, of course, know the location. Don't trespass anywhere. Never cross over fences without the landowner's permission. Those sorts of things, common sense things. But also know what your subject's going to be doing. Read up on birds and their behavior. A book I did this presentation recently, so I kept it out of my drawer. This is kind of the birder's Bible from Roger Tory Peterson, the Peterson Field Guide to Birds. And it gives you beautiful artwork, shows birds drawn by very skilled artists in their environment, and from what they look like from above and from behind and beneath. And it talks about their behaviors and where, what they're going to do at certain times of day. So a very handy guide for your phone. There is an app for that. I think for iPhone. I'm not sure it's available for Android yet. There, and of course, the Merlin Bird ID from Cornell University is another great thing. If you're not sure what a bird is, you open up that app, you put the bird's picture in the square where it asks you to put it in, and like that, it knows what the bird is and tells you some things about it. But know your subject, know what it's going to be doing when you get out in the field, and you're going to again be able to anticipate what the animals are doing, and when they take off from the roost in the morning, when they come back to roost in the evening, where they might be going in the middle of the day for getting their feed. And putting all those things together, this is a great blue heron that I am fortunate where I live in northern Colorado. I have some wetland areas near my home, and there are also some big old cottonwood trees that the herons roost in. So I know where they take off from in the morning. I know where they fly back to at night. And then just driving around my vicinity, I found where they go at different times of day to hunt for their food. And in this particular situation, this is a wetland of just a few minutes from my house, and I had, in between Tamron events, before COVID, I used to go on the road and come to places like Camera Company and do in-person seminars and field events and things like that. But in between events, I'd come home, I'd get out in the afternoon, I'd see the herons, and they were happily hunting, but as just off the edge of a busy county road. And as soon as I pulled my car onto the shoulder, that noise of the car hitting the gravel would sometimes spook them, and they'd take off. And one of the things, again, if you're getting close enough to an animal that you're changing its behavior, you're too close, so you need to back up or stop doing that. So I realized if I wanted to get photos of these birds in this environment, I was going to have to get there before they did, so that I wasn't scaring them away with my car. So after a few weeks of trial and error and frustration, I got there one afternoon, a half hour before the birds started to arrive. So I was able to do a couple of things. I was able to figure out where I wanted to shoot, and based again on previous observations where they tended to be landing and hunting, but also to do some test exposures with my cameras. You can see the bird is very heavily backlit, and which gives that beautiful fluorescent orange color in its beak. But it was going to be a silhouette if I didn't further compensate. So I did some test shots, 1/320th of a second. I was at f11 at ISO 400 that afternoon. And I ended up in my test shots determining that a plus 1.3 on my exposure compensation was going to give me the exposure I was looking for. So then it was a matter of just waiting for them to arrive. And with the 150 to 600, I zoomed the lens all the way out. I saw the birds flying in, and again, I wasn't sure where they were going to be coming from because they were feeding all over the area. But I found them and zoomed in, and even when they were still just kind of specks, I started firing so the camera had a chance to acquire and lock on focus. And as they approached, I fired a few more bursts and a few more bursts and a few more bursts. And one thing to note, when I'm shooting, I shoot in continuous autofocus. I shoot in the high speed frame rate with my camera. I'll reach under the desk here and pull up my birding camera. And I'm fortunate that I have a camera that shoots at a high frame rate, but I can shoot bursts like that, or I can shoot up to 10 frames a second if I need to. And most modern cameras will give you somewhere between 4 or 5 and up to 6, 8, and 10 frames a second in its high-speed burst mode. And simply there, it's I go back to my days as a newspaper photographer, photojournalist. You fired a lot of shots to get that one that was going to make the front page of the sports section, or maybe even the front page of the paper, depending upon the gravitas of the event. And so in birding photography, I still use that approach. In most other shooting situations, I don't shoot high-speed capture, but here I do. Now also, I was asked about where I should set my focus points. And with my particular cameras, and also talking to friends who shoot other brands, we found that either a single spot And you can generally, there's going to be a little thumb wheel on the back of your camera somewhere that you can rotate or move up and down or right and left, which will allow you to move that focus point around. So you can actually tell the camera where to focus. And again, this is practice makes perfect. It's something that you're going to want to go out and shoot and practice with and get comfortable. If you're not as comfortable with your camera as you are driving your car, play with your camera more. You know, you walk out of the house, you get into the car, you start the car, and put it into gear, and pretty much everything is automatic as you're driving. You can adjust the heat and the air conditioning and turn the radio on and off, and you know, to activate your signal, all while you're not taking your eyes off the road. So same kind of thing with photography. Get as comfortable and familiar with your camera as you are with your car, so that you know where those controls are and you can move to them without having to stop and take the camera away from your eye and look at it. So again, back to shooting the birds. Again, I'm on that, in my camera I can shoot either a single spot or I shoot a small group with like 4 very tightly grouped focus points. And I find sometimes for birds, because you're moving, this was a handheld shot, by the way, rather than on a monopod, because again, I wasn't sure where the birds were going to be coming from. So handheld, and I followed the birds as they approached me, and I picked one out and followed it as it glided in. Now that blue color on the feathers, I probably couldn't get that in another 1,000 shots or 1,000 attempts. That was simply right time, right frame in the camera and everything, and a little bit of luck. Birds' feathers are oily, so it keeps moisture off, and especially shorebirds tend to be like this, and geese and ducks and things like that. Oily feathers, and it's to repel, but it also reflects light. And I just got lucky right in that particular motion of the bird's wing flapping. It reflected the blue from the sky, and those oils in the feather gave that fantastic blue color. Again, the color on its neck is really the true color of its feathers. What happened was, it was just that reflection of the sky off the oil and the feathers gave me that. It's not a Photoshop thing, and again, I've tried to reproduce it hundreds of times with no success. So it was just a fluky thing. And again, with photography, there's that intersection of skill and luck that gives you something special once in a while, and that just happened there. Another thing to think about with your lenses is, as you're zooming in and out, pardon me, telephoto lenses compress distances and increase the magnification on distant subjects, even if you may or may not want that to happen in the viewfinder. So this particular shot was made with the 100 or 400 millimeter lens, and I like using the 1 to 400 because it's a lot lighter in weight than the 150 to 600. So especially if I'm going to be moving around and I'm close to the subject where I don't need the extra reach of the 600, I'll put this lens on because it weighs a lot less. It's simply easier on you. And here I was at 150 millimeters. Another thing we learned from birds in aviation is that, you know, planes take off into the wind, and we learned this because we discovered, studying birds before we learned how to fly, birds take off into the wind. So this particular morning, the wind was at my back. I knew that when the snow geese decided to launch, which was right then, that they were going to be coming straight at me. So here's another pro tip: always wear a hat. Always wear, like a weatherproof, waterproof kind of coat, because they're coming out of the water. They're going to be dripping pond water as they take off, and also birds tend to squirt and poop right after they take off, or just before they take off. Shorebirds like this tend to do it right after they take off, and people right and left of me, I didn't get pooped on, but some people do. So that way, you can take your hat off, you can take your jacket off, you can throw it in the wash, put another jacket on, put another hat on, and you're not standing there, you know, scratching your hair thinking, ugh, all day until you have a chance to go take a shower. So that's something, a little pro tip I learned early on when I was learning bird photography. But you'll notice that big cottonwood tree in the background. Now I'm at 150 millimeters here, and I'm fairly close to the shoreline in this shot. A different morning, I was using the 150 to 600, and I was out about 500 millimeters. And you'll notice I was actually physically probably 25 yards further up the shoreline than the previous shot, but that cottonwood tree is much larger in the view, and that's because of that magnification, that compression of the telephoto lens. So again, pay attention to those foreground background relationships, especially as you zoom in, because anything in the background is also going to be magnified in addition to your subject. And as you can see here, the geese are taking off toward camera left, and that's because the wind was coming off from the left-hand side of the frame that morning. So again, you can position yourself with birds to be where you want to be in terms of where they're going to take off in flight from where the wind is coming from too. So another thing to think about. Now, also compositionally, when you're looking at single birds, it's not a bad idea to maybe get them when they're low enough to have, in this case down in New Mexico, there are some foothills in the near distance. So I was able to photograph this nice image of the sandhill crane. Sun's right at my back, so I've got nice flat light on it. Everything, in the underside of the feathers is very nicely detailed, but it would have been kind of a little more boring if it was just the bird. So I watch my background, and I shoot with both eyes open, so I learned this from sports photography, so that you don't get run over by players that are out of your camera's frame, but that are coming straight at you and maybe can't stop in time to avoid running you over. But I also learn in bird photography, I'm looking for, not only through the lens, but what's happening in my surroundings. And in this case, I saw the bird coming up, and just as it peeked over that ridge line, visibly, I was able to fire the shot off there. So even though the mountain ridge is out of focus, it adds a little bit of anchor, and it uses a modified version of the rule of thirds, where it's taking up that lower diagonal third of the frame. And also, it doesn't quite enter the frame at the right-hand corner. It doesn't quite hit the corner of the frame. It's just above the corner. So keep branches and geographic features kind of right from out of the corner too. Just helps improve the composition a little bit. Now sometimes you do get lucky, and with this osprey that had just caught a fish, here I let the osprey kind of fill the frame. If you'll notice, there's usually some room in front of the subject there, and I do that on purpose so that again, you can kind of see my cursor there. There's a little blank space there, what we call as photographers negative space, and you want to give a subject some move to room into. Just uh, it makes for a less tense composition. So that's something to think about too. And different times of day yield, of course, different kinds of light. The morning light and the afternoon light are both going to give you that warmer, softer light because the sun is coming through more atmosphere. There's more particulate matter in the air and things like that. But in the morning, it tends to be a little softer light than in the afternoon. And this is, I don't have any scientific experience other than observational. In the afternoon, hot air balloons launch typically in the morning because the air is calmer. So there's not as much dirt and dust in the air as there is in the afternoon. The wind has come up, human activity has kicked up more dirt and dust into the air, pollutants, things like that. So you're going to find a little softer light in the morning than you do in the afternoon. Both can be equally beautiful, but you want to think about things like that too. And also, again, look for the good light. These geese on the morning shot, the left frame, the sun was right at my back. So again, they were very flat, broad lit. And in the afternoon, I was at a different angle in relation to the birds and to the light. So they were more crossing light. This is more like a classic portrait kind of lighting effect, where you see highlights and shadows. Now, again, because they're somewhat backlit, you lose some of that facial detail, but you get that beautiful warmth to the color. And again, these are pretty much straight out of camera shots. We don't do a lot in any of these shots with Photoshop because we want to show you what the lenses are capable of doing, not what our Photoshop skills are. So again, keep that in mind too. Now, for smaller birds like this American kestrel, it flies incredibly fast, and it's a bird not a whole lot bigger than a nice fat robin. So it's the tiniest of the American falcons, and kestrels fly stupid fast. I very rarely get good shots of kestrels in flight. So this one was kind enough to pose for me, and I've come back to what I think is the same bird on the same tree 2 or 3 years in a row at about the same time of year. This is late winter, March time frame. So there's no foliage on the trees yet. You can see it starting to bud out. So it gives you a nice, relatively clean looking branch for the bird to roost on. And it was nice enough to sit there for a few minutes and pose for me until it saw something uh, that it wanted to take off and try and catch for late lunch or early dinner. But sometimes the smaller birds, it's just simply easier to catch them on a branch or on a fence post or a high line wire or whatever. Another thing to think about when you're shooting in a park or in the forest or in the trees is color balance. The folks uh, at camera company can advise you on the different color balance tools that they carry. And there's something called custom white balance, which I use in unusual lighting situations like this. The birds' colors are pretty natural, but I got that because, as you can see, it's surrounded by green. The background is green. There were green uh, leaves above me, and if you leave your camera in automatic white balance, that light color, that white or near white in the bird's feathers is going to turn green. So by doing a custom white balance, now you can also do the presets on your camera. You can go to the shadow position or the shade position, but you may not be able to completely clean up that green. You may have to do a true custom white balance. Now, once you have a white balance tool, uh, and again, there's tutorials all over the web for getting custom white balance the way you want it. I use a tool called the Expo disc that I think camera company might carry. If not, they have something similar, which is it's a white disc that goes over the front of your lens, and you take a shot of where the light source is. So in this case, you just photograph up into the green of the trees, and then the camera knows. They call it white balance because electronic cameras have to know what color white is in order to give you the rest of the colors reproduced accurately on your memory card. So this saves me a lot of time in post. If you shoot JPEG, custom white balance is crucial. If you shoot raw file images, it's a time saver. You have to do less correction in post. So anyway, custom white balance I think is critical. Also, you'll notice the branch here again doesn't quite hit the edge, just below the edge, and again doesn't quite exit the frame at the top of the edge. Or in the corner of the frame. So keep things like that just out of the corners for a little stronger composition. Now another thing, and this is I throw this in because it's kind of unusual. There's a city park in Detroit called, I think, Kensington Park. I've never seen this happen anywhere else, but in their park gift shop, the animals in their park and it's a huge park, the animals are accustomed to humans. They sell bird feed. You can buy a cup of it, you can sprinkle some in your hand, and the birds will actually flitter in and land on your hand. And then, the photographer who was holding their hand out was also shooting like crazy, trying to get shots of the bird in its hand. So, in this case, the bird in the hand is worth two in the bush, because you got this great close-up. I was standing next to him, and I think I was having more fun. I was able to use longer lens and again throw the background completely out of focus, as you can see there, with the 18-400 at about 400. No, actually, I'm looking at my data here, 240 millimeters. So I was a good distance into the zoom of the lens. The woodpecker here, I didn't quite have time to go in and custom set my white balance here. So you can see I included this to show you that that's what happens if you don't nail your white balance. And it was something that I couldn't clean up completely in post. Also, this is about a 75% crop. So if your camera is fairly new and you're using a good sharp lens, you can crop in really tight even if you're shooting a tiny subject. Now, I'm not going to want to make a 16 by 20 out of this. This was also ISO 1600 because it was really dark and underneath the shadow of these trees. I had to go to a very ISO, and it gave me the option or the ability to shoot. But again, that woodpecker, tiny and not as close as I would have liked to have been. But again, if I took a couple of steps closer, it would flit away. So I was in its, just right at the edge of its comfort zone. So sometimes you do have to crop and be aware of that. This was also originally a horizontal frame, so I not only I cropped it to a vertical to make it a more interesting shot. So don't be afraid of doing that. If you can't fill up a frame, again, use some cropping, and if you've got, again, a fairly new camera, you're going to be able to get good results cropping in. And a good photo lab like Camera Company has, they can advise you on what's going to give you good results in cropping and getting the proportions right and what size prints that you'd like to make. Again, prints, no off switch. They make great gifts and they're archival. Your family is going to be able to, if you put a bunch of 4x6 photos into an album, just like our parents and grandparents did, your grandkids and great grandkids are going to be able to look at those and see what life was like in the early 21st century. They're probably not going to be able to retrieve data off of a hard drive in 25 or 50 years that might have been sitting in the attic all that time. If you've been involved in personal computing for any length of time, you know what I'm talking about. If you have floppy disks, you don't own a device probably today, unless again it's an old computer that you just hadn't taken and recycled yet, that would even be capable of inserting a floppy and retrieving the data from. The same thing is going to happen with our data storage methods that we're using today. Hard drives crash. They get lost, they get stolen. So of your best photos, make some prints, and it doesn't cost much, and they're going to give you that long-term ability to share your passions of photography. Also, don't be afraid to use technology. This was a handheld shot about 20 minutes after sunset, starting to get into the blue hour. I was driving around in the country and found this hawk sitting on top of the highline pole there. And I got as close as I thought I could before it would spook and take off. Pulled my 100 to 400 out because it happened to be the lens on the camera, racked it out to 400 millimeters. And this is at ISO 400, but at 1/125th of a second, or I'm sorry, at ISO 800 at 400 millimeters. And I was able to shoot and get a nice sharp picture. And that's the advantage that in lens stabilization and some of the newer mirrorless camera bodies, they'll have in-body stabilization. So we can take stabilizers out of the lens and rely on it in the body for giving us sharper photos. But in this case, the rule of thumb before lens stabilization became prominent, and most lenses have stabilizers now. But older lenses, like if I was shooting at 400 millimeters with a non-stabilized lens, I would have probably either had to pull out my tripod or monopod and set it up. And by that time, the bird would have taken off, because just moments after I took this, it again saw something and started hunting. But what happens is the rule of thumb used to be for whatever your focal length was, you didn't want your shutter speed to go below your focal length, or again, you might have a camera shake or blurred picture due to camera movement or lens movement. So with a 400 millimeter lens, I probably, without stabilization, couldn't have shot this at much below a 400th of a second handheld. So again, technology can be a huge benefit, especially for those quick grab shots. So take advantage of those tools that are built into your equipment also. Also, don't be afraid to get the camera out even when the weather is bad. Shoot on rainy days or cloudy days, or in this case, a foggy morning. Most modern lenses, especially from Tamron and most other makers, have weather seals. Most newer cameras also have weather seals. Check your owner's manual for both your lens and your camera. And if not, again, the camera company carries a number of different kinds of weather shields that you can just, sometimes there's one from a company called Optech that you can get two of in a package for, I think, under $10. And it's just like a giant baggie that you slide your lens and camera inside, and it has a drawstring to keep the moisture out at the front, and it has a little peephole in the back to put over your camera's viewfinder, and you stick your hands up underneath. But that way, if it's drizzling or raining or snowing, you don't worry about your equipment getting wet. And if I'm going to be out for a long time in the field, even with my weather sealed gear, I will tend to put a rain shield on just for that extra measure of protection, because you don't know when a moisture seal might fail for some reason. So that's important. But don't put the camera away in the fog or the wind or the rain or the snow. In this particular case, again, we were down at Bosque del Apache, and last November when the bird festival happened, people were getting frustrated because for the first 2 days of the event, it rained cats and dogs virtually all day and all night. Day 3, I got up in the morning and it had stopped raining. It had quit raining late afternoon the day before, but you know, after rain with temperature differentials, you get fog. So I looked out my window and I was up 3 hours before sunrise because I was leading a group that morning, and you want to be to the wetlands probably an hour before sunrise to start shooting at dawn. And as a result, looked out my window and I couldn't see from my hotel window to my car, which was probably 50 feet. The fog was that dense. And I thought it was going to make for interesting photography, which in fact it did. But the thing I told the people in my group, because I could hear people complaining in other groups around me, man, I've been here for 3 days and I haven't gotten a decent sharp picture of a bird the whole time. You know, the sharp pictures are going to come, but when you have this magical, mystical, foggy light, take advantage of it. Get out and shoot in the fog. It makes everything look different. You're going to have to learn how to manually focus. Your camera doesn't do well in low contrast situations like this. Camera sensors need contrast, that edge of light against dark, in order for the camera to tell the lens where to focus. And in a low contrast situation, shooting through the fog, you're going to have to manually. There's another assignment. Go out and play with your camera and learn how to use the manual focus mode. And because there are times when you're going to have to. Early morning, late at night, foggy, rainy days, there's not enough contrast for, or sometimes not enough light or enough contrast for the AF sensor to see. So you have to literally be your camera's eyes, which again is how I learned to photograph. So keep that in mind. But again, the sandhills were just kind of slowly plodding along, and they made for some really neat shots. But here it was an hour after the sun had come up. It was still this dark. ISO 3200. I was on my monopod at 1/100th of a second at 600 millimeters to get this shot. But as the birds were slowly walking, I was slowly panning and just, again, with the camera on the monopod, just slowly following them along. And again, a monopod is a great tool in those sorts of situations too. Now, eventually, the fog lifted enough where the birds decided to take off for the day. So I got a few shots of the snow geese. Again, they take off usually 20, 40 minutes before the sandhills decide to take off. And got this shot. Again, I had to manually focus. I was still at ISO 3200. I was at a 1/100th of a second, so I was very carefully panning as the birds were taking off. And I was at about the middle of the zoom range, about 400 millimeters at f10 on this one. Now, I get asked what these exposure values are, so I usually throw them out. But if you weren't standing next to me on that particular morning, you know, if you went out to try and recreate a similar scene the next time you see a foggy day, it could be a completely different set of exposure data. But people always like to hear that, so I always report it. Now you notice the birds at the front of the pack are sharp, and that lone goose by itself. And again, there's kind of that group of three. There's three, and then there's one, and then there's one. So that group of three comes into effect here too. But the one isn't quite sharp, but I left it, I didn't crop it out because I just like that group of three composition. So again, something to think about there in your composition. Look for those groups of three if you can. We drove around after the geese and cranes had taken off for the day, and I found later, about an hour later, where they went to forage for the day. So another part of the wetland area, a bank of fog had kind of moved back in here, And so I was waiting for some geese to fly in, landed, and again, rule of thirds, you'll notice they're in kind of that upper third, near, you know, about a third from the top of the frame, and about a third of the way in-ish. So that's why I say rather than rule of thirds, the suggestion of thirds. And then I had the birds in the foreground that added that nice anchor. Again, don't forget about shooting with wide angle lenses. This was at the original location. I saw this tree, and as the sandhill cranes began to take off, I thought this would be a very cool, mystic, kind of foggy, very ethereal shot with the birds disappearing into the fog. And I knew, again, the wind was coming across, so I knew that the birds were going to fly, you know, either in front or behind that tree. And they flew just behind it. So as I was firing away, they were going to disappear behind the tree. So that was the shot that I chose. But again, I've got that nice warm autumn color that was happening then against that very cool dull gray of the sky. So even when you're out shooting birds with your telephoto, you know, keep the wide angle handy, or if you have a backup or a second body, keep a wide angle or a short lens on the other camera too. Again, don't be afraid to go out in bad weather and shoot. We had our, well, I went camping over the weekend. We actually had our last snowstorm in Colorado on Sunday and Monday. And I got snowed on my camping trip, but near where I live, we had our last snowstorm about a month ago. And I went out to a local state park where I knew there were, again, are reliably herons and eagles and geese and ducks. And I found this heron hunting along the shoreline, and it was hopping from place to place looking for tasty morsels. And it had just taken off. So in the snow, those are all those white specks on the bird's wings. But I was shooting again in a snowstorm, manual focus again here. And it was a reasonably bright day, but I was still at ISO 1600 to get my thousandth of a second that I knew I was going to need for the bird in flight. And I was at it's 800 or 600 millimeters. But again, I was able to stop down to F18. So I had nearly wingtip to wingtip. But you'll notice again, the bird was fairly close to me. The edge of those close feathers is slightly soft. And again, that's not motion, that's actually depth of field into play there. Also go out and play with your camera to see what high ISO you're comfortable with shooting. Go out and shoot the same scene. Maybe go out, you know, early afternoon, late afternoon, even toward dusk, and shoot at 200 and maybe 400, 100, and then go to the higher ISOs and come back to your computer and maybe even make some 8x10s, go into the store or print them at home and see in an 8x10 just how high an ISO you're comfortable with shooting. Now, in this case, my camera goes to ridiculously high ISOs. I shot at 12,800. And it becomes a very artistic looking scene, especially in the underexposed areas. You see all those noise points, those off color, those color blobs, and that's what we call digital noise. So you're going to get that. The bird's face and eye is still tack sharp. So I was happy with that. Now, again, am I going to make a 20 by 40 inch print of this? No way. But it might look like a very interesting photo at an 8 by 10 or maybe an 11 by 14, and just something to play with. But know what your camera's limits are and how high an ISO you're realistically comfortable shooting. Now, a few minutes later, it was getting even darker. This bird was close to the shore, and actually the shoreline was kind of casting a shadow on it. But another one was standing out in a log, probably 40 yards out, that they anchor some logs in the lake for birds to roost on. And just for fun, again, this is probably a half hour later, it was practically dark, but I bumped my camera up to ISO 40,000, just to see what would happen. And also this is the VC stabilization in the 150 to 600 at work. I shot this handheld, not even on a monopod, at 1/40th of a second at ISO 40,000 at 600 millimeters. So again, that stabilization tool in the lens can make all the difference in just a grab handheld shot. Now, again, I probably wouldn't even make a 5x7 out of this because of the noise, but it's sharp. And again, that's because of the lens and the sharpness of the sensor in your camera. And even maybe get out and shoot some high flying birds. I gave you that tip on night sky photography. Near where I live, there's a nationally or internationally recognized dark sky area, and I'll go out there on moonless nights to photograph the Milky Way. And I was actually looking directly behind where this shot was made at the Milky Way coming up. But my phone has an app that tells me when the International Space Station is flying over. There are a number of apps that you can get that will tell you about celestial events and space stations and satellites coming over. So I got that International Space Station is coming up in 5 minutes. So I stopped what I was doing. I turned around and based on looking at the horizon where the app told me it was going to be rising, and shot a few frames as the space station came up over me. This is again a 30-second exposure, so that's how far it traveled in the sky at 150 or so miles above us at 17,500 miles an hour, which is how fast it has moved. So gravity doesn't pull it back down. And that other little streak that you see there kind of below the space station, I think is a little meteor that just whooped into the sky. The dome of light that you see is Cheyenne, Wyoming, about 70 or so miles away, maybe 90 miles from where I was. But a city will still put out that dome of light. And off to the left-hand frame, again, I mentioned it was 2 hours past sunset. There was still that much light coming over the horizon from the sun from the sunset. Now, I saw none of that in my frames looking the other direction at the Milky Way, but I wanted to include this as a high-flying bird for fun in the shot, in the presentation. One more last tool to think about before we wrap it up here is a polarizing filter. Camera company carries probably a number of different grades of polarizers. Get the best one you can afford. It will pay for itself. Polarizers, just like polarizers, do a couple of things for you. They reduce their purpose. Now you do lose up to close to 2 stops of light with the polarizer, so you're going to have to compensate for that either with the lower shutter speed or increasing your ISO to maintain a shutter speed, or you're going to have to open up the lens. But they reduce glare off of water, so again, shorebirds. They also make the sky a darker blue, so birds in the sky. They make the clouds stand out against the sky, but they reduce that glare off of water, glass, tree leaves. You notice the better color saturation even on the tree leaves. They're not that dull green. They're kind of a lighter, brighter green because the reflection has been changed off of the tree leaves. So a polarizer is a really handy tool for birding, but again, be aware that it will cost you some light, and it works best at a right angle to the sun. So think of keeping the sun over your shoulder to get the maximum benefit from it. But yeah, you rotate the polarizer, you can see it so you know what you're getting too. So I'll wrap it up at that point. Again, if we don't have time for a question, message me at Tamron Tech Jeff. And thanks to our hosts at Camera Company again for hosting us today. And we'll open it up to the chat. I imagine Steve and Ed have probably been answering questions in the chat as we've been going here.
Yeah, there haven't been a lot, and
Okay.
I think they're pretty much covered. So
All right.
unless anybody has a last minute question, I think we're good.
All right. And I don't see any other things. And I see Steve mentioned, this is important. Several Tamron lenses, courtesy of Camera Company right now, do have the ability when you buy your lens. I know it's with the 18 to 400, and I think maybe 1 or 2 other lenses.
There's a few, yeah.
You can actually
The higher end
circular
lenses
polarizer.
too.
So if you're yeah. Right. So if you're looking for a new lens, this might be a great time to invest, because you can also, there's a number of rebates, as Steve mentioned. There's some Father's Day rebates that start tomorrow, and some ongoing national rebates that we already have. Again, the folks at Camera Company can tell you all about it. And
I can also do it if they join me tomorrow during the virtual demo, which again is, I put the information in the chat section. from 1 to 3. Yeah, I'll be doing that with the camera company, and we'll have all the information about all the rebates and which lenses come with circular polarizers and all of that kind of stuff. Be
Oh,
there to
fantastic.
answer questions and see what we can do.
Yeah, so again, if you come up with a question that we didn't get to today, or again, something pops up, you sit up in bed at 2 in the morning and say, oh, I knew there was something I meant to ask. You'll have that opportunity tomorrow with Steve to get that answered, or drop me a line. And again, if I don't see any more questions popping up, so we'll wrap it up here. And thank you all for joining us today. Thanks once again to our friends at the camera company. We do a lot of events with them virtually during these COVID times, and when the world gets healthier and it's safer to get out again, we'll be back doing in-person presentations because I'd like to get out of my house more too.
And
And I'm
hopefully
sure.
some shooting events.
Absolutely. We've done a number of great shooting events over the years with camera companies. So as things loosen up again, I hope we'll be able to get back to some of those too. But I will say thank you and good afternoon. And Steve, if
Nope, that's
you,
it. I'm out.
all right,
Bye,
thanks.
all.
And
Thanks,
bye.
Ed.
Thanks, everyone.